Mayor. Elara, what is this?
She was almost gone when he said, "I never ordered a bride, but I would have asked for you." Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sun, a great golden coin, was slowly being tucked away by the distant purple hills, and long, sleepy shadows were stretching across the little village like a comfortable blanket. In a small cottage right on the edge of where the tidy gardens met the wild woods, a young man named Leo was just finishing the last of his supper, a simple stew of vegetables from his own garden and a heel of brown bread. He was a woodcarver by trade, and his home was filled with the sweet, sharp smell of pine and oak, a smell that clung to his clothes and his hair and seemed as much a part of him as his own two hands. Those hands, though often nicked and scratched from his work, were gentle, and they could shape a rough block of wood into the most delicate of creatures. A bird with feathers so fine you expected it to chirp, a squirrel caught forever in a moment of playful curiosity. But for all the life he could create with his tools, his own home felt strangely empty and still. The cottage had 2 rooms, and the silence in the second room was a heavy one, a quiet that seemed to listen back to him when he moved through his solitary routines. He was a kind soul, was Leo, well-liked in the village for his skill and his quiet manner, but he was also a profoundly lonely one, though he had long since grown used to the feeling, treating it like a familiar, if unwelcome, guest that had taken up permanent residence by his fireside. This particular evening, the only sounds were the cheerful crackle of the fire in the hearth and the soft scraping of his spoon against the clay bowl. He was just about to rise and clean his plate when a sound that was decidedly not part of his usual evening melody echoed through the quiet. A firm, official-sounding knock at his heavy wooden door. It was a knock that suggested importance, that carried with it the weight of something out of the ordinary. A little surprised, for visitors were rare at this hour, Leo wiped his hands on his apron and crossed the room, pulling the door open with a soft creak of its hinges. There on his doorstep, illuminated by the warm firelight spilling from within, stood the village mayor, a man named Thomas, who was known for his bushy eyebrows and his serious, often worried expression. But it was not the mayor who captured Leo's immediate and complete attention. It was the figure who stood just half a step behind him, almost hidden in the mayor's shadow. She was a young woman, perhaps not much younger than Leo himself, though the weariness in her posture made it difficult to tell. She was dressed in a simple, travel-worn dress of a faded gray-blue, the hem dusty from the road. She clutched a small, sad-looking cloth bundle in her arms, holding it as if it contained everything she owned in the entire world, which, as it turned out, it very nearly did. But it was her face that struck Leo most deeply. She kept her eyes downcast, fixed on the worn stones of his doorstep, but he could see the delicate line of her cheek, pale and smudged with a faint trail of dust or perhaps dried tears. Her hair, the color of dark honey, had escaped from its simple braid in wispy strands that framed her face, and she seemed to be holding herself very still, as if moving or making a sound might cause some terrible, final consequence. She looked utterly lost and completely alone. The mayor, Thomas, cleared his throat, a rough, grating sound that broke the strange silence of the moment. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking uncomfortable, as if he'd rather be anywhere else but here, delivering whatever news he had to deliver. "Leo," he began, his voice overly formal, the way he used it when reading announcements in the village square. "Good evening. I apologize for the intrusion at this hour." He gestured with a tilt of his head toward the young woman beside him. "This is Elara. She has come a very long way from a village in the far valley beyond the northern pass." He paused, choosing his words with obvious care. "Her family, there has been an arrangement made. An agreement, you understand. They have sent her here. She is, well, she is to be your bride." The words hung in the air between them, so unbelievable, so utterly nonsensical, that for a moment Leo was certain he had misheard. He blinked, his mind struggling to make sense of the mayor's sentence. His bride? He looked from the mayor's earnest, anxious face to the top of the young woman's, Elara's, head, as she seemed to shrink even further into herself at the words. A cold shock, followed by a wave of hot confusion, washed over him. My bride? He finally managed to stammer out, his own voice sounding strange to his ears. But Mayor Thomas, sir, there must be some terrible mistake. I never ordered a bride. I would never such a thing. I would never do such a thing without meeting someone. Without an agreement between us. The idea was unthinkable. A person was not a package to be sent and received. A marriage was a partnership, a friendship, the most important choice of one's life. It wasn't something to be arranged in secret and delivered to one's doorstep like a sack of flour. The mayor sighed, a long, weary sound that suggested he had anticipated this reaction and had spent the entire walk over rehearsing his response. He looked genuinely sorry, but also resolved. I understand your surprise, Leo. Truly I do. It is unusual, but the arrangement has been made. Her family has sent her. The papers are in order. She has nowhere else to go. He lowered his voice slightly, though the young woman could undoubtedly still hear every word. It would be a great dishonor to her and to her family to refuse to send her back. A disgrace she would likely never recover from. You are a good man, Leo. A kind man. She needs a home. You have a home. It was a brutally simple equation, and the mayor presented it as an unchangeable fact, like the setting of the sun or the coming of winter. He placed a hand briefly on Leo's shoulder, a gesture meant to be comforting, but which felt like a verdict. I will leave you to it, then. Good luck to you both. And with a final tip of his hat, Mayor Thomas turned and walked back down the path, his figure quickly swallowed up by the deepening twilight, leaving Leo standing in his doorway, staring in stunned disbelief at the silent, motionless young woman who was apparently now his responsibility. The door was open. The cool evening air was drifting in, and his quiet, predictable life had just been utterly and completely upended. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, a sound that seemed to echo far louder in the new, profound silence of the cottage than it ever had before. Leo stood with his back against it for a moment, as if he needed its solidity to keep him upright, his mind reeling from the whirlwind that had just descended upon his peaceful life. Before him, the young woman, Elara, remained utterly still, a statue carved from weariness and apprehension, her eyes still fastened to the floorboards, as if she had discovered the most fascinating pattern in the wood grain and dared not look away. The air in the room, once filled with the comfortable smells of wood smoke and stew, now felt thick and charged with an unspoken tension, 1,000 questions hanging between them that neither seemed capable of voicing. The crackle of the fire in the hearth, usually a cheerful and companionable sound, now seemed only to emphasize the awkwardness, each pop and hiss a sharp punctuation in the overwhelming quiet. Leo's thoughts were a frantic, tangled knot. A bride. My bride. How is such a thing possible? Who does such a thing? He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing past the initial shock to the details. The way her shoulders were slightly hunched, not in laziness, but as if expecting a blow. The way her fingers, pale and slender, were clenched so tightly around the fabric of her small bundle that her knuckles were white. She wasn't just quiet, she was terrified. And in that moment, Leo's own confusion and alarm began to be tempered by a slow, swelling wave of pity. This was not her choice either. She was as much a prisoner of this strange arrangement as he was, perhaps more so, for she was the one who had been sent away from everything she knew, delivered to a stranger's door like a lost parcel. His own discomfort felt suddenly selfish. However bewildered he was in his own home, on familiar ground. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and the few pitiful possessions in that bundle. He knew, with the grim certainty that had accompanied the mayor's words about dishonor, that he could not, in good conscience, turn her out. It was unthinkable. The night was cool, and the world beyond his door was vast and unknown to her. Whatever this was, however it had happened, she was here, and she was under his roof, and that meant she was under his protection. The word bride was a terrifying and foreign title, but the word guest was one he understood deeply. Every law of hospitality he had ever been taught demanded he offer shelter and safety. He took a slow, steadying breath, pushing his own panic down, determined to be the calm in this shared storm. "Please," he said, and his voice came out softer than he intended, a gentle rumble in the quiet room. You must be tired from your journey." He gestured vaguely toward the interior of the cottage, away from the door. Would you like to come in and sit by the fire? I can make some tea." It sounded so foolish, so mundane, in the face of such a monumental situation. Tea, as if a warm drink could possibly mend the strangeness of it all. She didn't look up, but after a long moment, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the smallest of movements, but it was a response. Carefully, as if moving around a startled deer, Leo stepped aside, giving her a wide berth to enter further into the room. She took a few hesitant steps, her movements quiet and hesitant, her gaze finally lifting just enough to take in the room without ever quite landing on him. She seemed to absorb the details: the sturdy table, the carved chairs, the tools neatly hung on the wall, the half-finished figure of a fox on his workbench. She stood uncertainly in the center of the room, looking profoundly out of place. I have a spare room," Leo continued, feeling the need to fill the silence with practicalities. "It's small, and it's just at the back there. It's not much, but it's clean. The bed is made. You can use that room for as long as you need." He was choosing his words with extreme care, wanting to be clear, wanted to offer reassurance without making any assumptions that would frighten her further. "You will be my guest," he said, putting a firm emphasis on the last word. "And you are safe here. I promise you that." At the word safe, her eyes flickered up toward him for the briefest second, and he caught a glimpse of a deep, ocean blue before her lashes swept down again. There was a world of sadness in that fleeting glance. She nodded again, this time a little more surely, and without a word, she moved toward the doorway he had indicated, her steps silent on the stone floor. She paused at the threshold of the small room, looking in at the narrow bed, the simple chest, the small window looking out into the darkening garden. It was a room of pure function, but it was private. It was hers. She turned back toward him, and for a moment, it seemed she might finally speak. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. Instead, she gave him a small, stiff bow of her head, a gesture of acknowledgement, of thanks perhaps, but also of a deep and profound resignation. Then, she slipped inside the room and gently closed the door, the soft click of the latch sounding like the period at the end of a very strange and unsettling sentence. Leo was left alone in his main room. The fire crackled. The night pressed against the windows. The second bowl he had set out for his uneaten stew sat on the table, a silent testament to the new, complicated reality of his life. The cottage was no longer quiet in its usual way. The silence now had a shape, a presence, a weight. It was the silence of another human being just on the other side of a door, and he had no idea how to bridge the immense distance between them. He sank into his chair by the fire, not to relax, but to think, to try and unravel the impossible situation he had found himself in, all while being acutely, painfully aware of the quiet breathing of the stranger in his home. The dawn of the next day did little to lift the heavy veil of awkwardness that had settled over the cottage. Leo awoke from a fitful sleep, his mind still churning with the unreality of the previous evening. For a moment, in the hazy space between dreams and waking, he hoped it had all been a strange trick of the imagination. But the sight of his own familiar ceiling and the profound, listening silence from the other room confirmed it was not. He rose quietly, moving with the care he usually reserved for approaching a skittish animal in the woods, and set about rebuilding the fire, the routine actions a small anchor in a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar. He could hear no movement from behind the closed door of the spare room, and he wondered, with a pang of anxiety, if she was even still there, or if she had vanished in the night like a ghost. He was just setting a pot of water to boil for porridge when the door creaked open. Elara emerged, looking as pale and tired as she had the night before, her dress smooth but still carrying the wrinkles of a long journey. She hesitated in the doorway, her eyes darting around the room before landing on the floor. Leo felt a fresh wave of that bewildering responsibility. What did one say to a person who had been delivered to one's home under such circumstances? Good morning felt absurdly cheerful. Silence felt like rejection. There is water in the pitcher for washing, he said, his voice low and calm, pointing to the basin in the corner. And porridge will be ready soon. If you are hungry. She gave that same, nearly invisible nod and moved to the basin, her movements economical and silent. The next hour passed in a silence, so deep it was deafening. They ate their simple breakfast at opposite ends of the table, the scraping of spoons against bowls the only conversation. Leo's mind raced, searching for a thread, any thread, to begin unraveling this impossible knot. He could not send her away, but he could not live in this suffocating quiet either. He had to find a way to make her understand that while he was as trapped as she was by this arrangement, he was not her jailer. After breakfast, she immediately began to clear the bowls, her actions automatic, those of someone used to making themselves useful to earning their keep. Leo watched her for a moment, a deep sadness settling in his chest. This was not right. She was acting like a servant, not a guest, and certainly not like whatever she was supposed to be. He stood up slowly. "You don't have to do that," he said gently. "Truly, you're a guest here. There is no debt to be paid." Her hands stilled on the bowl she was holding, but she didn't look up. He could see the tension in her shoulders. He realized then that the work was perhaps a shield for her, a way to hide within a familiar role, to avoid the terrifying uncertainty of their situation. But he wanted to offer her something more than just a hiding place. He wanted to offer a glimpse of himself, of the life she had been thrust into, in the hope that it might make her feel less like an intruder and more like, he didn't know what, but something better than this. He took a breath. "I'm a wood carver," he said, stating the obvious, but it was a place to start. He gestured toward his workbench, a chaotic landscape of tools and wood shavings and half-formed creatures. "That is my work. Would you like to see?" It was a risk. She might refuse with another silent nod. She might not care at all, but it was the only thing he had to offer that was truly his. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she placed the bowl back on the table and turned her head, just slightly, her gaze drifting toward the workbench. It was not a yes, but it was not a no. Leo took it as the small victory it was. He walked over to the bench, not looking back to see if she followed, giving her the space to choose. He picked up a small, finished piece, a badger, its head tilted inquisitively, every line of its fur lovingly detailed. "This is oak," he said, more to the badger than to her. "It's hard, but it holds fine detail well. It takes a patient hand." He heard the soft rustle of her dress behind him. She had followed, stopping a few paces back, but she was there. Her eyes were on the badger, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something in them that wasn't fear or sadness. It was curiosity. Emboldened, he showed her another piece, a graceful heron carved from pale, smooth birch, its long neck curved in an elegant arc. "This wood is softer," he explained, his voice falling into the gentle rhythm he used when explaining his craft to the village children. "It is easier to shape, but you must be careful not to take too much away at once." He continued like this for some time, moving around the bench, showing her different tools, the gouges for scooping out wood, the fine chisels for details, the rough rasps for shaping. He talked about the different types of wood, their smells, their grains, their spirits. He wasn't expecting a response. He was simply offering a window into his world. And she listened. She didn't speak, but she watched, her eyes moving from his hands to the wood and back again, absorbing it all. Then an idea came to him. He reached for a small, off-cut block of soft pine, perfect for a beginner. He picked up a spare knife, one with a blunt tip, safe for inexperienced hands. He turned to her, holding them out. Would you like to try?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's just a scrap. There is no right or wrong way. It can be peaceful." He expected her to shrink back, to refuse. But she didn't. She looked from the block of wood to his face, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but a glimmer of tentative interest, a fragile spark of life igniting after a long darkness. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took the wood and the knife from his hands. Her fingers brushed against his for the briefest second, and the contact was so unexpected, so human amidst all the strangeness, that it sent a jolt through him. She turned the block over in her hands, feeling its weight, its texture. Then, tentatively, she pressed the tip of the knife against the wood and made a small, shallow cut. A tiny curl of pale, with shaving peeled away and drifted to the floor. She looked at it, then made another cut and another. She wasn't carving anything in particular, just learning the pressure needed, the way the blade moved through the grain. Leo watched her, not offering advice unless she seemed truly stuck, simply giving her the space to explore. The only sounds in the cottage were the soft scraping of her knife and the gentle crackle of the fire. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty and heavy with dread. It was a shared silence, a comfortable, working quiet, the kind that exists between two people who are, in their own small way, beginning to communicate without needing words at all. It was the first fragile thread of a bridge being built between two separate islands. The fragile piece that had begun to weave itself through the cottage, built on the quiet language of shared activity and mutual, unspoken respect, lasted for several days. A new routine, delicate as a spider's web, had established itself. Each morning, Leo would rise to find that Elara had already quietly lit the fire and set the water to boil, a small, persistent act of contribution he had ceased trying to discourage, recognizing it as her way of finding a foothold in this strange new world. They would share their meals in a silence that was no longer painfully awkward, but often companionable, punctuated by the occasional soft question from Leo about the wood grain or the weather, answered by her with a nod or a shake of her head, and very rarely a single soft word. Warmer, she might say of the day, or softer, of a piece of limewood he handed her. Her carving had improved from hesitant scratches to deliberate, if simple, shapes. She had moved from random cuts to trying to form the basic outline of a leaf, her brow furrowed in concentration, her entire being focused on the task. Leo would watch her from his own workbench, a strange warmth spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He found himself noticing things, the way a stray beam of sunlight caught the honey-colored strands of her hair, the faint, focused line that appeared between her eyebrows when she was working through a tricky bit of grain, the rare and fleeting ghost of a smile that would touch her lips when a cut went exactly right. He began to wish, with a fervency that surprised him, that they had met under different circumstances, that he could have seen her across the village square and worked up the courage to speak to her, to offer her a flower, to ask her father for permission to court her properly. The word bride, which had once felt like a cold, iron shackle, now began to conjure a different feeling entirely, one of tentative, hopeful possibility. He started to imagine what it might be like if her smiles became less fleeting, if her words became less rare, if the quiet between them one day became filled with easy conversation and laughter. It was on an afternoon painted in the soft gold of the declining sun that the fragile equilibrium of their world was shattered. A sharp, official rap on the cottage door echoed through the room, so similar to the knock that had heralded Elara's arrival that Leo's heart gave a painful lurch. He opened the door to find not the mayor, but a young boy from the village, the son of the postmaster, holding out a folded piece of parchment sealed with a blob of plain wax. "For the miss," the boy said, his eyes wide with curiosity before he ducked his head and scampered back down the path. Leo took the letter, his fingers feeling strangely clumsy. It was addressed simply to Elara in a loose, unpracticed script. He turned and carried it to her where she sat by the window, a half-carved bird in her hands. "Elara," he said softly, holding it out. "A letter for you." She looked up, and the sight of the parchment in his hand seemed to drain all the color from her face. The small carving bird tumbled from her grasp onto the floor, forgotten. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out and took it, her eyes wide with what looked unmistakably like fear. She stared at the seal as if it were a venomous creature. Then, With a jerky movement, she broke it and unfolded the paper. Leo turned away, giving her privacy, busying himself with tidying his tools, though his every sense was acutely attuned to her. He heard the rustle of the paper, then a sharp, choked intake of breath that was more sob than gasp. The rustling stopped. The silence that followed was of a different, more terrible quality than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with a devastation so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. After what felt like an eternity, he heard her rise, her movements slow and heavy, as if she were moving through deep water. He turned to see her walking toward the spare room, the letter clutched in her hand, her shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound. She did not emerge for the rest of the evening. Leo left a bowl of stew and a piece of bread on the table for her, but when he awoke the next morning, it remained untouched. The cottage felt colder, the silence once again a heavy, suffocating blanket. The hopeful possibilities he had dared to imagine had vanished, replaced by a cold dread. Something in that letter had broken the delicate truce they had built. It was that evening, as Leo sat staring into the dying embers of the fire, that her door finally opened. She emerged, dressed not in her usual house dress, but in the same travel-worn gray-blue dress she had arrived in. Her small cloth bundle was in her hands, neatly retied. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She had made a decision. She walked to the center of the room and stopped, and for the first time since her arrival, she lifted her head and looked directly at him. Her gaze was clear and steady, though immense sadness swam in its depths. "Leo," she said, and her voice, though quiet, was firm and resolved. It was the most she had ever said to him at once. "Thank you. Thank you for your incredible kindness. You have been a better friend to me, a better man to me, than I had any right to hope for in this situation." She took a shaky breath, her composure wavering for just a second before she steadied it. "But I received a letter. From my sister. She has written to tell me the truth. My family's actions were not just unusual. They were wrong. They were desperate, and they were dishonorable. They sent me here without your knowledge, without your consent, to solve their own troubles." The words hung in the air, confirming Leo's initial fears and painting them in even darker shades. "I see now, clearly, that I cannot stay. I cannot live my life in a home that was never truly offered, with a man who never truly wanted me. I must leave. I must find my own path, whatever that may be." Leo's heart felt as though it were being squeezed in a vice. He wanted to shout, to argue, to tell her that it didn't matter how she got here, that things were different now, that he did want her to stay. But the honesty in her words, the raw dignity in her decision, struck him mute. She was right. His kindness, however genuine, had been born of pity and obligation. He had never once asked her to stay. He had only ever made the best of a bad situation. And she deserved more than that. She deserved a choice. And so, his throat tight with a grief he hadn't known was possible, all he could do was nod, his own eyes burning, accepting the terrible, honorable truth of her decision. The night that followed Elara's announcement was the longest and most desolate of Leo's life. He did not sleep. He lay on his bed, staring into the absolute blackness of the room, listening to the faint, almost imperceptible sounds of movement from the other side of the wall. Each rustle, each soft footstep, was a tiny hammer blow against his heart, a relentless reminder that she was there, packing the meager entirety of her life back into that one small bundle, preparing to walk out his door and out of his world forever. The cozy familiarity of his cottage, which had always been his sanctuary, now felt like a cage of regret, the walls seeming to press in on him, echoing with the ghost of a future that had briefly, tantalizingly glimmered before being extinguished. He replayed their every interaction in his mind, her silent fear, her tentative curiosity, the focused line of her brow as she carved, the rare and precious glimpse of a smile. He had been so focused on being kind, on being honorable, on navigating the strangeness of the situation, that he had failed to see the quiet, strong, beautiful person emerging from her shell until it was too late. He had been a gracious host, but he had not been brave. When the first faint hints of gray began to lighten the window pane, signaling the approach of a dawn he dreaded, Leo forced himself to rise. His body felt heavy, as if weighed down by stones. He moved through the morning routine by rote, his actions mechanical and devoid of their usual purpose. He built up the fire, its cheerfulness a mockery of his mood. He measured out oats and water into a pot, though the thought of food turned his stomach. He knew she would need sustenance for her journey, wherever that journey might lead. He could not let her go hungry. It was the last, pathetic offering he could make. The door to her room opened just as the sun's first real rays, pale and watery, streamed through the eastern window. Elara emerged, dressed for travel, her bundle under her arm. She looked as though she had not slept either, shadows like bruises under her eyes. But her posture was straight, her resolve visibly steeling itself for the ordeal ahead. She had made her choice, and she would see it through with a dignity that made Leo's heart ache. She glanced at the pot of porridge simmering over the fire and then at him, and gave a small, sad shake of her head. She could not eat. The moment was too large, too final, for something as mundane as breakfast. I prepared this for you," Leo said, his voice rough with unshed tears and a night of silence. He gestured to a cloth-wrapped parcel on the table next to a full water skin. "Some bread, cheese, and apple. For your journey." It was so inadequate. How did you pack for a future that was a complete unknown? She looked at the parcel, and for a moment, her composure threatened to crack. Her lips trembled slightly before she pressed them together and nodded, a gesture of genuine gratitude this time. She picked up the food and the water, adding them to her small bundle. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. There was nothing left to say. The time for words, for explanations, for the things he should have said but didn't was over. All that remained was the leaving. Leo pulled on his own coat and opened the cottage door. The morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of dew-damp grass and distant pine. It was a beautiful morning, a cruel contrast to the sorrow that sat like a lead weight in his chest. Elara stepped out past him, pausing for one last moment on the threshold to look back into the cottage, at the fire, the workbench, the table where they had shared so many silent meals. Her gaze was lingering, full of a complex mixture of sadness and a strange, fond regret, as if she were memorizing it. Then she turned and began to walk down the path that led away from the cottage, away from the village, toward the main road that split the world in two. Leo followed, a few paces behind, a silent, grieving escort to the end of this chapter. The gravel crunched under their feet, the sound absurdly loud in the stillness of the morning. They passed the garden where he grew his vegetables, the old oak tree whose acorns he collected for the pigs, the fence post he had been meaning to mend. Every familiar landmark was now a monument to his failure, a reminder of the life he could have shared. They reached the crossroads at the edge of the village. This was the place where paths diverged, where choices were made. To the left, the road wound back the way she had come, toward her family and the life that had betrayed her. To the right, it led toward the river and the wider world, places unknown to both of them. She stopped here, at the very spot where the mayor had left them just days before, though it felt like a lifetime. She turned to face him one last time. The rising sun was behind her, outlining her form in a soft, golden light, making it difficult to see the details of her face, blurring her features into a beautiful, heartbreaking silhouette. "Goodbye, Leo," she said, and her voice was clear and steady, though it held the weight of all the words unsaid between them. "I will never forget your goodness." It was a blessing and a condemnation all at once. He was good, but he had not been enough. She turned away from him, her decision made, and chose the road to the right, the road toward the new and the unknown. And she began to walk. Leo stood rooted to the spot, watching her go. Each step she took was a step away from him, a step into a solitude far deeper and more terrifying than any he had ever known in his quiet cottage. He watched the straight line of her back, the determined set of her shoulders, as the distance between them grew. She became smaller, her figure diminishing with every passing second, transforming from a person into a shape, then a blur, and then, finally, just a faint speck of gray-blue against the vast, green landscape. The world, which had felt so small and intimate with her in it, now felt immense and empty. She was almost gone, and with her, she took all the color, all the warmth, all the fragile, hopeful light that had just begun to seep into his life. He was alone again, but this time, the loneliness was not a familiar guest. It was a yawning chasm, and he was standing on the edge, watching the one thing that could have filled it walk away forever. Leo stood at the crossroads, a statue of grief carved from human misery, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Elara's form had finally vanished from his sight. The world around him continued its indifferent cycle. A bird sang from a nearby branch. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the hawthorn bush. The sun climbed higher, warming the stones at his feet. But to Leo, it was as if the entire universe had ground to a halt, its colors bleached to gray, its sounds muffled by a thick, suffocating wool. The silence she left behind was not the quiet of his old solitude. That silence had been expectant, filled with the potential for his own thoughts and the sounds of his own making. This new silence was absolute, a void, a crushing emptiness that pressed in on him from all sides, heavier and more profound than any physical weight. He replayed her final words in his mind, a torturous echo. "I will never forget your goodness." The words, meant as a kindness, now felt like the sharpest of blades. Goodness. What was goodness if it let the most precious thing he had ever encountered simply walk away? What was honor if it demanded he stand silent while his own heart was shattering inside his chest? He had been so careful, so proper, so determined to do the right thing by the rules of others. The mayor's rules, society's rules, the rules of a hollow arrangement. He had offered shelter, he had offered patience, he had offered a quiet friendship, but he had never offered his heart. He had never spoken the truth that had been growing inside him, a truth he had only fully recognized the moment she announced she was leaving. The image of her face, pale and resolute in the morning light, swam before his eyes, not as a burden delivered to his doorstep, but as Elara. Elara, who learned the grain of wood with a fierce concentration. Elara, whose rare smile could light up the dimmest corner of his workshop. Elara, who had faced an unimaginable situation with a grace and strength he could only admire. She hadn't chosen to come to him, but she had chosen to leave him, not out of spite, but out of a powerful, dignified need for a life built on truth and mutual wanting. And in doing so, she had shown him what real courage looked like. It wasn't just enduring a bad situation. It was having the bravery to walk away from it and into the unknown. A terrible, rising panic began to replace the numbness in his veins. She was almost gone. The thought was a lightning strike, jolting him from his paralysis. Every second he stood here, she was moving farther away. Every beat of his heart was a measure of the distance growing between them, a distance that would soon become irreversible. The chasm of loneliness that had opened before him was not his fate. It was a choice. His choice. He was choosing it by standing here, by doing nothing, by letting fear and a misguided sense of propriety dictate his future. He was about to lose her not because of a family's dishonorable arrangement, but because of his own cowardice. A sound escaped his lips, a raw, choked gasp that was half sob, half battle cry. It was the sound of a dam breaking inside him, of all his careful control and quiet acceptance shattering into a million pieces. The truth, so long unspoken, could no longer be contained. It erupted from him, fueled by a desperation more powerful than any fear. He started to run. His legs, feeling stiff and foreign, pumped beneath him, carrying him down the dusty road she had taken. The parcel of food he had packed for her, the symbol of his passive goodness, lay forgotten on the ground at the crossroads. He ran as he had never run before, not with the easy gait of a man chasing a stray animal, but with the frantic, all-consuming urgency of a man chasing his entire future. The world blurred at the edges of his vision, the green of the fields, the blue of the sky, all melting into a streaked haze. His breath sawed in and out of his lungs, burning with the effort, but he did not slow. His eyes were fixed ahead, scanning the road for that one speck of gray-blue, praying he was not too late. And then he saw her, a small, distant figure, steadfast and alone, walking toward the rising sun. She was so far away, already a part of the landscape, almost indistinguishable from the rolling hills. The sight of her, so small and yet so monumentally important, lent a final, desperate speed to his limbs. "Elara!" he cried out, his voice tearing from his throat, raw and cracked with emotion. It was the first time he had ever shouted her name, and the sound of it echoed across the open fields, startling a flock of birds into flight. "Wait! Please wait!" The distant figure halted. Slowly, she turned. He could not see her expression from this distance, only her stillness, the question in her posture. He ran on, closing the gap between them, his heart hammering against his ribs like a wild thing trying to escape. He did not stop until he was right before her, stumbling to a halt, his chest heaving, dust coating his boots and trousers. The air between them was thick with the sound of his ragged breathing and the immensity of the moment. He looked into her face, into her beautiful, confused eyes, which were wide with shock and a dawning, fragile hope. He saw the traces of tears on her cheeks from her own lonely walk. All the words he had practiced in his mind vanished, leaving only the pure, unvarnished truth. His voice, when it came, was breathless, shaking with the force of his emotion, but it was clear and strong and filled with a conviction that came from the very depths of his soul. "I never ordered a bride," he said, the words tumbling out, each one a confession, a plea, a promise. "But if I had been given the chance, if I had been asked to choose one myself from all the world, I would have asked for you. Only you. Please, please don't go." For a moment that stretched into eternity, the world on that dusty road ceased to turn. The breeze stilled. The birdsong faded into a distant hum. There was only the two of them, locked in a silence more profound than any they had shared within the walls of the cottage, a silence charged with the seismic shift that had just occurred. Leo's words hung in the air between them, not as a plea anymore, but as a truth so solid and real it seemed to shimmer. "I would have asked for you." He stood before her, chest still heaving from his frantic run, his face etched with a raw, vulnerable hope, his entire heart offered up in his gaze, waiting for her judgment. He had laid bare his soul, and now he was utterly defenseless, his fate entirely in her hands. Elara did not move. She simply stared at him, her eyes wide, her lips slightly parted in stunned disbelief. She watched him as if seeing him for the very first time, not as the kind woodcarver who had been forced to host her, not as the quiet man who had offered patient lessons, but as Leo, a man who had just run down a country road, forsaking all dignity to stop her from leaving. A man who had chosen her. The meaning of his words, the sheer, breathtaking force of them, began to seep through the layers of her sadness and her resignation, melting the icy resolve that had encased her heart. He hadn't just asked her to stay. He had rewritten their entire story. She was no longer an unwanted obligation delivered to his door. In his eyes, she was a choice, a desire, a hope. And then, a single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. But it was not a tear of sorrow. It was followed by another, and then another, a quiet cascade of release. The tension that had held her spine so rigid for weeks seemed to dissolve, and her shoulders, which had carried the weight of her family's decision and her own despair, finally relaxed. Her breath let out in a soft, shuddering sigh that was half a sob, half a laugh of pure, unadulterated wonder. And then, for the first time since Leo had known her, a real, true, and radiant smile blossomed on her face. It was not the fleeting, ghostly impression he had glimpsed before. It was a sunrise, a transformation so complete and beautiful that it stole the very air from his lungs. It lit her from within, banishing the shadows from her eyes, and in that moment, she was not just pretty, she was luminous. She didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. Instead, she simply nodded, a firm, sure, and joyful movement. And then she stepped forward, closing the small distance that remained between them, and placed her hand in his. Her fingers, once so cold and hesitant when holding a carving knife, were now warm and certain as they laced through his. It was an answer. It was a promise. It was a new beginning, forged not from an arrangement, but from a choice made by two people standing together on an open road. The walk back to the cottage was a journey into a different world. The same path that had been a march toward a lonely future mere minutes before was now a pilgrimage of shared joy. They walked hand in hand, not racing, but savoring each step. They didn't speak much, but the silence was now filled with a new, humming energy, a shared, incredulous happiness. They looked at each other, and then away, and then back again, as if to confirm that the other was still real, still there, still choosing to be there. The sun felt warmer. The green of the field seemed brighter, and the cottage, when it came into view, was no longer just a house of quiet solitude, but a home waiting to be filled. The days and weeks that followed were a gentle and joyful exploration. They learned each other properly, without the heavy shadow of the arrangement looming over them. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their silly fears, and their deepest hopes. Leo learned that Elara had a quiet, sharp wit that could make him laugh aloud, a sound that now frequently echoed through the cottage. Elara discovered that Leo, when he wasn't being cautiously kind, was deeply thoughtful and passionately loved the stories hidden in the grains of different woods. Their partnership deepened naturally. Leo continued his carving, and Elara, one day, picked up a brush and some pigments he used for staining. Tentatively, she added delicate strokes of color to a carved songbird, a touch of red on its breast, a dot of black for its eye. Leo watched, mesmerized, as his creation came to life in a new way under her hand. From that day on, they worked together. He would shape the forms, and she would paint them, her artistry complementing his, their creations becoming a true symbol of their union. The cottage was no longer quiet, but filled with the comfortable sounds of shared work, easy conversation, and genuine, heartfelt laughter. Their wedding, when it came, was not a fulfillment of a contract, but a celebration of a love that had been chosen. The entire village came, their initial curiosity replaced by genuine happiness for the quiet woodcarver and his gentle, smiling wife. They were married not because they had to be, but because they wanted to be, standing before their friends and declaring the vows they themselves had written, their hands clasped tightly together, their eyes locked on one another. They built a life not on the shaky foundation of someone else's decision, but on the solid rock of mutual respect, friendship, kindness, and the unwavering knowledge that they had each been chosen. They had learned that the greatest happiness is not found in simply accepting what is given to you, but in having the courage to choose your own path and to walk it hand in hand with someone who chooses you in return. If you enjoyed this story of kindness, courage, and finding your true path, please let us know by liking this video. Share it with a friend who might enjoy a timeless tale, and subscribe for more stories that warm the heart. Thank you for watching.